Welcome to APUSH. Today we're going to be giving just a brief overview of some of the different groups of Native Americans living in North America prior to any sort of European contact. So, without further ado, you should be able to know some things about the different language groups, explain some of the challenges with studying pre-Columbian Native Americans, and articulate the importance of the spread of intensive agriculture, which we'll be going into here in a minute. So, let's get into it. Humans moved for a variety of different reasons, usually following food sources or to escape problems of overpopulation, and we think humans arrived in the Americas, somewhere around 12,000 years ago. We honestly don't know a lot about these early Native Americans. There's some archaeological sites and some fossil evidence, but you find an owl like this, and what can you know about the people who created it? I mean, some things. You know that there was some division of labor, that they probably had some form of organized religion, because, I mean, you're spending enough time to like carve an owl out of a stone. But as far as what the purpose the owl served or anything else about the society, it's somewhat nebulous. And so we rely a lot on guesswork and fossil records and things like that because there are no written records for any of these pre-Columbian Native American tribes. So that leaves us in somewhat of a difficult place as historians trying to study this topic. We can guess that they were for the most part hunters and gatherers as they migrated in, and then eventually settled down as they began to cultivate different plants and animals. We know that agriculture spread throughout the Americas from a variety of different places. In the Americas, there are a couple different domestication or zones of early domestication. In South America, gourds and squash were cultivated along the Pacific coast. In the Mississippi River Valley, we had gourds and sunflowers. But the most important crops were corn, beans, and then squash. And we're going to get into the Three Sisters here momentarily. The challenges North America faces are somewhat obvious when you look at this map of where domesticated plants and animals come from. So take a moment, pause the video, and take it in. You'll notice that most of the useful animals, in the animals that you can actually use for farm labor and transport, come from Europe or Eurasia. And these animals, of course, spread throughout Eurasia. The horse used to exist in the Americas, but it became extinct tens of thousands of years ago. And so the only domesticated animals that Native Americans had access to in North America is the turkey, which is a delicious but not super useful animal. And in South America, llamas and alpacas, which you can sometimes like strap something to them and get them to do stuff for you. But as far as like hitching them to a plow, that's just not going to fly. So that's somewhat of a problem. Overcoming this problem, Native Americans used what's called the Three Sisters method of agriculture. This allowed them to plant three crops on the same plot of land: corn, as you can see here, beans, which would then trellis up the corn, and squash as a ground cover. This was an ingenious planting method because it ended up being nitrogen neutral to the soil, allowing Native Americans to use intensive agriculture without necessarily being in a river floodplain like happened in some of the European societies. So the Three Sisters, incredibly important. And selective breeding allowed the maize or the corn plant to become much more productive over time, moving from the sort of meager plant you see here on the left to a much more robust modern corn ear that you see on the right. These cereal grasses are incredibly important because they, one, produce a significant yield for the amount of land that is required, and secondarily can be ground up and preserved as flour, which can then be stored much more easily and is much less likely to rot than trying to store a variety of other food sources, especially meats, which were very difficult to store without smoking or salting. Agriculture spread quickly throughout the American continent, leading to more complex societies. You can sort of see the spread out of Mesoamerica here. And with that came larger populations, larger settlements, greater technology, more complicated government and religious structures, and all the things that come with, honestly, all the things that people can spend their time doing when they're not starving to death. Because in general, when you have to spend a significant amount of your time producing food and you don't necessarily know where, or you don't have a steady supply of food, this really cuts down on the amount of sort of cultural building your society can do. We generally break down Native Americans into a variety of different. Obviously, Native American peoples are incredibly diverse, and so in order to somewhat simplify and make them allow us to talk about them in some detail, we break down Native Americans into language groups, where these language groups often share some elements of common culture, although there's also some clear differences within these language groups. So we're going to start looking at a variety of different language groups here and just giving a brief overview, but keep in mind, of course, that not all tribes fit the stereotype, and we're not going to talk about all the language groups, and there's a variety of differences even within language groups. So this is the best we can do, and it's not great. One of the things that does sort of hold throughout these different language groups is that the Native Americans adapted very well to their environments. So, in areas that had more rainfall and more access to rivers, you'd see intensive agriculture. In areas that were more difficult to farm, you'd see often swidden farming and gathering, and some gathering. And then you'd see more specific hunting and gathering when you get into the plains, the deserts, the Arctic. And then along the coast, you'd also see a significant amount of fishing and those types of activities. So these Native American tribes adapted very well to their environments. Muskegean peoples are the group that we're going to look at first. They have settled down along the southern Mississippi River Valley and created or birthed all of these different Native American cultures as agriculture and technology spread throughout the Mississippi River whole floodplain and drainage area. This is usually known as the Southeastern Ceremonial Complex because similar items have been recovered from burial sites throughout the lower Mississippi River Valley. And so throughout all of this area, we see similar construction, we see similar ruins, and we see a lot of similar artifacts, items like these. These civilizations were also known as mound builders because they created large burial mounds from which these artifacts were discovered. These burial mounds are often somewhat complex, as you can see here. It's in the shape of a snake. And within, of course, those burial mounds, you'd find a lot of important artifacts and that had usually some level of. Within these burial mounds, you'd find artifacts that would clearly have some measure of religious significance. The largest city in this ceremonial complex is the city of Cahokia, which was at an important sort of juncture between a number of these different civilizations. The city at its height may have had a population of over 10,000 people, and we know it was sort of built around, based on the ruins that we've excavated, this sort of central ziggurat. Although today there is nothing left, and we have no written records or any eyewitness accounts of anyone who actually saw the city at its height. So most of what we know is conjecture, but we think it was an important cultural/trading hub, and the civilization that birthed it was destroyed long before Europeans showed up. So there were large complex civilizations in North America, but most of them had collapsed by the time Europeans started making significant inroads into the continent. The Aztecan peoples lived in the southwest of the United States and northern Mexico. You can see them sort of over here and then in this area. They also shared some similar characteristics, although they had their own sort of large civilizations. These are also known as the Pueblo peoples. They are known for extensive irrigation, because of course this part of the country is relatively dry, for relatively large cities for the time and place, which we still have some of the ruins of. They are also known for their complicated pottery, which you can see here. And they're also known for their famous cliff dwellings. Unfortunately, their Pueblo civilization declined and collapsed before Europeans showed up. And so we don't have anyone who actually interacted with the Pueblo peoples to talk about what their civilization was like. And it's possible that they declined because of either climate change or a natural disaster, or possibly other aggressive tribes. Honestly, all that we have about the collapse of the Pueblo civilization is conjecture. Siouan peoples lived out on the plains, and we use them as an example of some of the hunting and gathering civilizations. You can see them sort of in the central United States here. They were very nomadic, following herds of buffalo, usually with domesticated dogs, in order to help them track and follow the buffalo herds. And these buffalo herds provided subsistence, they provided material for clothing, they provided sort of spiritual icons, and were central to Siouan culture. And then the Algonquin peoples lived sort of in the northeast of the United States. The Algonquins we can see coming all the way from Canada down through the Great Lakes region and across here. The Algonquin peoples practiced, some of them practiced intensive agriculture, and others of them had a more swidden farming and gathering or hunting and gathering system. And we know that, especially up in the north, they were primarily hunters. And so, obviously, not a lot of in depth knowledge about these different groups. We're also going to eventually talk about the Iroquois because they play a large role in our story. But now, but the goal is to just give you a basic overview of these different societies and to talk a little bit about how they organize themselves. So when they show up in our narrative, you have some sense of what these Native American groups did, how they lived, and what was important to them. So here are the objectives. Hopefully, you were able to follow along with that, and you can answer these questions about the different Native American tribes we talked about today. For tomorrow, we're going to move south and talk about more complicated and large empires.